Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this IFS analysis of the summer economic update. Thank you very much for joining us in this webinar. The update yesterday was not a full budget. We don't have a full set of public finance numbers to run through. And despite the large amount of money spent, there were a relatively limited number of measures. But my colleagues, Carl Emmerson, Joyce and Helen will run through the main elements of the package that was unveiled in a moment. But let me start with some brief context. This was another big package, a very big one in terms of money spent. In normal times, and actually even in a normal recession, we would have been somewhat taken aback by the scale of the measures announced, particularly given that they were announced outside of a budget. Up to £30 billion of measures, plus £33 billion of public service spending not previously accounted for. On any measure, that is a very big fiscal event indeed. But of course, this is no normal recession. It's the deepest in our history. This was, as the Chancellor said, the second, but not the final, act in his response. The first involves spending huge amounts, over £130 billion, essentially to respond directly to the virus and preserve the economy pretty much as it was. Given the lockdown, this was necessary. And being largely about simply giving money out, it was actually relatively straightforward. You can disperse £60 billion through a scheme like the CJRS, or add £8 billion to the welfare bill really quite easily, at least in a practical sense. The second and subsequent acts, which we're now going through, are much trickier to deliver and much trickier to get right. They need to get the balance between preserving those parts of the economy which have a long-term future and helping the transition to a new normal. They also need to actually deliver goods and services and change. And that is just very different from simply dispersing cash. This phase needs to get several things right. First, and possibly hardest, there's timing. Timing of when to withdraw support and how quickly. The Corona Job Retention Scheme can't last forever. The Chancellor had already settled on a gradual withdrawal through to the end of October. We simply can't know whether that will be too fast or too slow. It's a balance and it's a difficult one. Then there's the timing of when to introduce stimulus measures like the VAT cut for hospitality. Maybe it would have been better to wait until we know whether the real problems on the demand side, people need to be encouraged to go out and eat, there a VAT cut might be useful, or on the supply side, with social distancing, maybe restaurants can't serve enough people to service the demand anyway, in which case the VAT cut will be less useful. And then there's a timing of when to withdraw the new stimulus measures. We know, for example, the stamp duty holiday is due to be withdrawn in March next year. We know that the VAT reduction for hospitality is due to be withdrawn in January. Will that be too early if the economy is not booming yet? The stamp duty holiday is withdrawn when the economy is still in the doldrums and the housing market is still suffering. Maybe that's too early, maybe it's too late. And then there's scale. How much is needed? Is 30 billion enough? I'm not sure we can answer that. Probably more important in terms of scale is how much can actually be delivered. It's much harder to run a kickstart scheme and make sure it's effective than it is to run the Corona Job Retention Scheme. The same goes for energy efficiency programs, apprenticeships, and so on. It's not enough to say the spending and programs should have been bigger, if that's what you think. You need to be sure you can deliver them, even at the scale announced. That's going to be seriously challenging. Normally, we'd also be asking in terms of scale, can it be afforded? Today, the question is better posed as what's needed and what can be delivered. Affordability can wait for now. Finally, there is the issue of value for money and additionality. Even in a crisis, we shouldn't ignore the basics. A lot, probably a majority of the job retention bonus money will go in respect of jobs that would have been, indeed already have been, returned from furlough anyway. Recall that this money will go even in respect of jobs which were briefly furloughed, are already back at work, can expect to be still back at work in January, and the employer still gets the £1,000. Much of the VAT cut and the stamp duty cut will be dead weight, but that may be fine if they have a significant behavioural consequence. And then looking at the public service spending, committing 15 billion for PPE may be necessary, but I think we can expect to pay quite a lot for the equipment that buys. I expect the next phase in the autumn budget will still be looking to support a recovery. We'll know more about the progress of both the virus and the economy at that point. This should allow for more targeted support, perhaps more targeted tax cuts, perhaps more thought through investment programs, more developed job support schemes, and of course a spending review. The time to pay for all this will come, but not this year and not next. And our capacity to do so will depend above all on how the economy recovers, hence the focus on recovery at the moment. And our focus today, like the Chancellor yesterday, will be on this support and recovery phase. But let's hold in the back of our minds that a reckoning in the form of higher taxes will come eventually. That's all I want to say by way of introduction. Just to remind you, if you want to ask questions, you can go to Slido. It should be on the bottom of the video you're watching, and also in the email you received confirming that you're attending this. You can go to the main Slido website and use the code IFS as well. I'll stop there. I'm going to hand over first to Carl Emmerson, who will talk about the public finances and spending quantities here. Then Rob Joyce will talk about some of the labour market schemes. And finally, Helen Miller will look at some of the other schemes, in particular the tax changes. I'll stop there and hand over to Carl. Thank you all.
Thank you, Paul. So I'm going to talk about the size of the package of measures that the Chancellor set out yesterday, put that in the context of all of the measures that we've heard from him in response to the coronavirus that have come about since March, and then conclude with a few thoughts on the public finances. So if we go back to March, before the full implications of the coronavirus for the UK had become anything like clear, the Chancellor set out some temporary measures to help us through what was meant to be not too difficult a time at that point. The package totaled £12 billion. But within weeks, we had the economic lockdown and we had the huge response to that, including the job retention scheme. Now, the costings of that package of measures were refined a few times, but as of last month, the OBR put the package at totaling £133 billion. So that's £121 billion more than what we would have anticipated at the time of the March budget. And that's the information we had from official sources up until yesterday. And those numbers then changed because of two distinct packages. First, the one that I think got a lot less attention was the £33 billion extra money made available to public services over and above extra money that had already been available since March. If you missed it, it's in footnote 6 of table 2 of the Treasury document, a £33 billion injection. That's more than the jobs fund that the Chancellor spent most of his speech focusing on. It brings the total amount of the package up to £160 billion. The total support for public services, the extra 33, brings the total support up to 49 billion. And I want to talk a bit about where that 49 billion pounds is going. So of the 49, 32, about 2/3 is going to the NHS, the remainder going to other public services. So perhaps not surprisingly, the NHS gets the lion's share of the extra support. In terms of other public services, you can see pretty large chunks going to local government, going to social care, going to public transport. There's also some money for schools and some money made available through the Barnett formula for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So the NHS gets £32 billion. Where's that money going? Well, as Paul just said, £15 billion has been made available to purchase PPE for frontline staff. £10 billion has been made available for the NHS's test and trace scheme, and a remainder £7 billion going elsewhere within the NHS system. So of that 49 billion, an astonishing 25 billion going on purchasing PPE and the test and trace scheme. So that brought the size of the package up to almost £160 billion. Then we had the £30 billion plan for jobs that the Chancellor focused his speech on yesterday, bringing the total package of support up to almost £190 billion. That's about 9% of what the UK economy produced in the last financial year. Clearly a huge injection of support in terms of lower taxes, in terms of higher public spending, aimed at supporting public services, supporting households and supporting business. So what about that £30 billion plan for jobs that was announced yesterday? Well, firstly, we have a set of measures that Joyce is going to speak through in a moment, the job retention bonus, which will cost up to £9 billion, depending on how many employees who are currently furloughed are retained by their employers through to January. And we have £1 to £2 billion spent on each of the new Kickstart programme and the DWP programmes for work search, skills and apprenticeships. Then we have a set of measures that Helen Miller is going to talk through. We have the VAT cut for hospitality, accommodation and attractions. We have the voucher scheme for restaurant meals on Mondays to Wednesdays through August, stamp duty holiday that runs through till March, and also the Green Homes Grant. And finally, we have a set of measures that we're not going to focus on in today's talks, the bringing forward of £5 billion of infrastructure spending that the Prime Minister set out last week, plus a plan to spend more on trying to make both public sector properties and social housing greener with better insulation. So where does this all leave the public finances? Well, it's pretty obvious that if you've got almost £190 billion of emergency support and you've got much weaker economic activity, you're going to have a substantial weakening of your public finances. There'll be lower tax revenues this year and there'll be higher spending. Back in March, the government forecast a deficit of about £50 to £60 billion this year. Current estimate, it could well be around £350 billion. There is a huge amount of uncertainty around that figure. What is clear is that we are going to borrow more as a share of GDP than we did at the peak of the financial crisis. And in fact, the UK will borrow more as a share of GDP than it ever has done in the last 300 years outside of the two world wars. It's also worth remembering that at the moment the government is borrowing incredibly cheaply. Actually, we think that debt interest spending over the next few years is likely to be lower than what we thought back in March. So despite the extra borrowing, the reduction in interest rates more than outweighs that. And what that means is if you can borrow money and then spend it well and spend it in ways which means that the economy will recover more strongly, then that borrowing is almost certainly likely to be worthwhile. But the Chancellor also said in his speech yesterday that over the medium term, we must and we will put our public finances back on a sustainable footing. Now, what I think that means is that once we're through the crisis phase, once the economy's established its new normal, we're probably going to find that the economy is not as big as what it would have been had the coronavirus never hit. If that's the case, and it's very likely to be the case, revenues will still be depressed. And if we want to try then to bring the deficit back to where it would have been absent the crisis, we will need to do some spending cuts or, given a decade of austerity, perhaps more likely, some tax rises. And even if we do bring the deficit back to its pre-crisis path, of course, we'll still have the higher debt stock from all the extra borrowing we've accumulated in the current financial year. And managing that elevated debt, and in particular, the risk that the relationship between interest rates and economic growth turns out to be less favourable than it is at the moment, will be a task for not just the current Chancellor, but also many of his successors. It's going to take decades before we manage that debt back down to the levels we were used to pre this crisis. So to conclude, the jobs package announced yesterday is large, up to £30 billion worth of support. It comes on top of an additional £33 billion announced for public services, and it brings the total amount of support that we've seen since March up towards £190 billion, a huge injection. It's worth noting this package keeps getting added to, and I think that pattern is pretty likely to continue. That's not a criticism. It's important that the Chancellor remains nimble at a time like this. It really wouldn't be a surprise if in the autumn he decides that some new schemes are needed, or perhaps some of the current schemes need to be extended for a little bit longer. It would be surprising if this really was the last word in the amount of support that's provided. And finally, once we are through this and once the economy has got back to something like a new normal, I think tax rises are very likely. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. So I'm now going to talk about some of the labour market policies that were announced yesterday. And of course, the context for this is that without support, many jobs now would simply not be viable. We've had about 9 million people who have been furloughed at least some point over the last few months, with the government paying 80% of their prior wages. That furlough scheme is to be tapered down from next month and removed completely from November. And yet we don't know how quickly labour demand will actually bounce back, and it certainly won't have bounced back fully by the time that the furlough scheme starts getting tapered down. And so the government is rightly very worried about a potential spike in unemployment and the consequences of that as this furlough scheme is wound down. And the first measure that I want to talk through that it announced in that light is the so-called job retention bonus. And what this essentially is an attempt to try to help some more workers cling on to their work for a little bit longer after the end of that furlough scheme. So this is an £1,000 bonus for employing a worker who you previously had furloughed, for employing them up until the end of January, as long as they earn above a rather small amount. So that flat rate of £1,000 means that the impact here is going to be largest on the incentives to keep on lower earners. It's going to cover a much larger fraction of their costs. It can, for really very low earners, cover more than half of the direct cost of employing them over that November to January 3-month period. But typically it'd be a lot less than that, even for a typical furloughed worker who is themselves on rather low earnings. This subsidy would cover less than a quarter of the direct employer costs over that 3-month November to January period, which in normal times is actually not at all a small subsidy, something around a quarter of wage costs and other direct employer costs. But it's a lot less than we have been providing through the furlough scheme thus far, of course. And in these times, it is doubtful how many jobs that might save if labour demand continues to be very weak. There probably will be a lot of workers whose productivity is more than a quarter less than normal due to social distancing requirements and all the implications of that, and weak consumer demand as well. And so it is really inevitable that a lot of this money will be what's often termed deadweight, that is spending money in this case on workers who would have been retained anyway. Especially because this will actually, as far as we understand, cover workers who have already been brought back from furlough. There are some reasons why the government might have thought it needed to do that to avoid some perverse incentives, but that will be a consequence that will make the deadweight probably particularly large, and that may well be the inevitable effect of this policy, really, rather than actually changing the numbers employed that dramatically over that period. It will largely just be a transfer to firms who are bringing back workers from furlough, but would have done that anyway, or indeed have already done so. Now, even if there is some tangible, significant effect on the number of jobs that are attained after the furlough scheme is wound down, it would only, of course, be for this 3-month period. It's really therefore premised on the hope that labour demand is much stronger by February. If it's not, then this will at most just push the problem back. And as Carl has already said, this is one of the examples where we may well therefore see extensions or the replacement of this with some variant that's trying to achieve much the same thing later on. Now, the second major policy I want to talk about is one focused on young people. But this is really, it's an acknowledgement that despite efforts like the job retention bonus, there is highly likely to be a spike in unemployment, and the government wants to help to try to pick some of those people up off the floor and help them get a footing back in the labour market. And it's particularly concerned here about young people. And you can see here that young people have been, as they often are in recessions, and perhaps particularly this one, the most likely to have their work disrupted, to be furloughed or not working as a result of this crisis. And there are also good reasons to worry that the impact of a period of career disruption like this can be particularly sharp for young workers. So the government has announced what it's calling a kickstart scheme for the under 25s. And what this will be is 6-month work placements for those on universal credit who are judged at risk of long-term unemployment, and if the jobs are additional. And that the two bits in quotes here are quite important. They're not yet precisely defined, and there will be significant issues how you figure out who is at risk of long-term unemployment. It's quite likely that they will do this by waiting to see who does spend some time unemployed without getting a job after they fall out of work. That's what's been done with similar schemes in the past. Difficult to come up with a better alternative than that, to come up with some kind of crystal ball in advance for predicting who's going to be in this position before they spent months in that position. But of course, ideally one would do so. But so exactly how the government figures that problem out will be potentially important. And the issue of additional jobs is always an issue with these kinds of policies. What you ideally do not want to be happening is for employers to be offering placements that are really substituting for work that would have been done by other employees. Difficult to achieve completely, but important to try to ensure, of course, that this work is additional. The subsidy is going to be up to the equivalent of 25 hours per week at the minimum wage. And so what this means, again, is that this will be largest proportionally for those in for low paid and part-time work placements. So that means it's going to target probably some of the most vulnerable people with some of the least good alternative options, people who may well otherwise just spend some time with no work at all, for example. And the structure in this sense is very similar to the structure of the last recession's Future Jobs Fund, which the Labour government introduced, and which was later shown to have had a lasting impact on the employment rates of those who used it. But I think there are a number of challenges and also just limitations of this policy that are worth talking about. One is the issue of whether low-paid, part-time, temporary work, which is what this policy will most incentivize, is really a kickstart to something more. The government's hinting with the name that it hopes this can be like a stepping stone back into the labour market or onto the career ladder. That would, of course, be fantastic. It's what we should be aiming for. But it may be difficult. Much will depend here on the rest of the labour market. If you want to put people on the bottom of the jobs ladder in the hope that they will then be able to climb it, you need vacancies, obviously, to be appearing higher up the ladder as well, that people can move on to. If we have an extended period of very high unemployment, it probably makes it more likely that a lot of what will happen here is that employers may rotate between unemployed workers in these temporary placements rather than forming longer-term matches. Probably for some people, spending another year in education will be a better option, worth noting that. Also just worth noting who this scheme doesn't cover. There's nothing on close to this scale for older workers, and yet the scale of the disruption that they have faced is huge as well and far bigger than in any normal recession. There are good reasons to focus on younger workers, absolutely. But about 85% of those who have been made furloughed or unemployed are 25 or over. So we really shouldn't forget about them. There are other measures that I'll talk about in a minute that would be designed to help that group too, but nothing on this scale. And it may be an especially difficult time to be an unemployed person who's aged just over 24. It's quite a lot more expensive to hire them than people who are very, very similar but just slightly younger, in part because of this kickstart scheme. But it's already the case as well that the minimum wage for those aged 25 or over is somewhat higher than it is for those younger. So it's really worth keeping a close eye on older groups as well, including those just a little bit older. Well, wrapping up, there are an array of other measures which, just because of time, I can't possibly do justice to. But these are important, potentially more money for apprenticeships and traineeships. So in the skills area, more resources for various activities that Job Centre Plus and DWP will do. That's really important. DWP has a hell of a task on its hands. It's in some sense had quite a good crisis in that it seems to have done quite well in getting money out the door despite the huge increase in demand for it, getting that money paid. But it's now got a really, really big challenge in playing a part in helping the labour market particularly the low-skilled labour market, recover from what it's been through. These other measures do reflect a broadly sensible set of priorities, I think it's fair to say, in terms of skills and DWP resourcing. Many policies, including these and others, could be extended again or replaced with new variants. That's, I think, very, very likely and picks up on a theme that Carl mentioned. Several of the policies here, including the ones I've talked about in more detail, face a common challenge, I think, which is that can they help stimulate really lasting and high quality jobs? I've talked about some reasons for caution about that with respect to the Kickstart scheme, but history also suggests, for example, some reasons for doubt about the quality of lots of extra apprenticeships as well. So that's going to be a common challenge. And I think that relates to my last point, which is that, we've got a huge amount to do here to just get back to zero, in the sense that, if we just avoid a large and persistent spike in unemployment, given what we've been through, that will in itself be a real achievement. But we really also want to avoid the kind of stagnant productivity and earnings that followed the last crisis. And that will in part be about getting the right people into the right jobs as well. And that's going to be very important for our living standards going forward. So I'll stop there and hand over to Helen.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm going to pick up some of the other measures that the Chancellor announced to try to get the economy moving. He announced 2 measures aimed at helping those sectors that are particularly badly hit by the crisis. That includes a temporary VAT cut on food, accommodation and attractions, and some discounts on some of the meals eaten out in August. Whether either of these measures are going to be effective really depends a great deal on whether there is capacity in these sectors. So if there are empty restaurant seats and empty hotel rooms that could be filled, these policies could boost output and help project jobs. If, however, it's social distancing that's a constraint, so restaurants, attractions, hotels are as full as they can be, or will soon be as full as they can be, given the social distancing constraints, then this policy will effectively be a giveaway without very much fiscal stimulus, and actually quite a poorly targeted giveaway. So customers might benefit through lower prices, but the kinds of people who are going out aren't necessarily those who have been most badly affected by the crisis. With the VAT cut, I'd actually expect firms to benefit to a large extent. Many firms will choose not to pass through the VAT cut to consumers. Now, of course, that will be helpful to those firms that are struggling. It will give them some extra income. But the firms that benefit most will be those who have the highest sales, who are operating closest to normal. So it won't be targeted at those firms that are struggling most. So if the aim of this policy was to help firms, then there would have been more direct ways to do it. On the voucher scheme, I don't think firms will be able to put up their prices very easily to capture some of the benefits. But I think a serious issue is going to be fraud and the extent to which the government will be able to determine, for example, if a cafe has a revenue of £100, did that come from 5 £20 meals or 2 £50 meals? So there'll be some details to work out there in the administration of the scheme. As with all fiscal stimulus measures, timing is absolutely critical. It's also particularly difficult in this crisis. In a normal recession, we would want to be boosting spending and output as soon as possible. Of course, in this crisis, we are purposely capping supply. And what I've basically just been going through is, if it's the case that we can't increase output anymore, given the social distancing constraints, now is not the time for a fiscal stimulus. We're effectively going too early. So lots of uncertainty there, but an important question about whether now is the right time. It's also possible that the VAT cut, which is due to end in January next year, will be ending too soon. It seems plausible to me that at that point, social distancing constraints will have been eased, but the economy will still be weak. So that could be a good time to have a fiscal stimulus, not a time to be ending one. One last comment on the discounts for meals in August. I think it's a very strong case that takeaways should be included. When you think of it, it's a bit odd that they've been excluded. Just a week ago, we thought that the risks of eating in restaurants was sufficiently high that we banned it. Now we're effectively saying that in August, we're going to make takeaways relatively more expensive than eating in, even for the same food eaten from the same establishment. It would be more impactful to include takeaways in the measure. There are fewer supply constraints on providing them. More firms would therefore be able to increase their output. It would benefit those firms that have particularly small physical spaces that they can't expand very much more. It might help some of those firms that are located near to work locations rather than home locations, so they could still serve some people. And perhaps importantly, it might allow us to help keep within the social distancing rules. That might be especially important in areas where the virus transmission is rising and where, for example, maybe local lockdowns look likely. So a strong case there to modify that scheme. One of the other measures the government announced were grants to subsidise energy efficient investments in households. I've put the details of the schemes here. One of the big aims of the policy as set out by the Chancellor was to boost jobs. Now, how much it does that is going to depend on a number of factors, basically including how many people take up the schemes and whether that leads firms to want to take on more workers, and if so, whether they can train those workers quickly enough. There's some uncertainty there. Two other risks to flag with the scheme. One is that it will simply lead to higher prices, particularly if the scope of eligible spending is narrow. So to take an extreme example, if the policy only included boilers or only insulation, we'd expect the prices to be driven up. So ideally, the scope of spending should be as broad as possible within the energy efficiency category. There's also a risk coming from the fact that for low-income households, they'll be fully subsidised. That means that they could be making some poor investment choices, even where the cost of the of an investment isn't outweighed by the benefits. The investment may still go ahead because the individuals themselves aren't bearing any of the costs. It also provides an incentive for maybe some unscrupulous suppliers to inflate prices because they can maybe capture some more of the benefit of the government without having any impact on consumers. So a couple of risks with that scheme. Finally, I'll talk about the stamp duty land tax holiday. This schedule is showing you the tax payable under the current system. So there's a main schedule for most people's main homes. Stamp duty kicks in at £125,000. First-time buyers already have a discount. For them, stamp duty kicks in at £300,000. This schedule in blue shows the holiday. So basically now the stamp duty will kick in at £500,000. And you can see that the maximum tax break therefore is pretty large. It's £15,000. You can also see that mechanically it is smaller for first-time buyers because they already have this discount. But actually, more importantly than that, this is a group who may actually be made worse off by the policy. And the key to understanding that is to realise that although it's buyers who are formally required to hand over stamp duty, the effect of stamp duty can be passed through to sellers. So when there's a tax break, that can lead to the prices of houses going up so that sellers capture some of the benefits. Now, when the tax break was just for first-time buyers, it was more likely that they would retain some of that benefit. Now it's across the whole market, it's more likely that prices will rise, and therefore first-time buyers could be left basically keeping less of the discount that they already had. But even holding that aside, stamp duty land tax cuts are a pretty effective stimulus. What I'm showing you here is residential property transactions for the last couple of decades. You can see on the right-hand side of the chart the big drop that's happened this year. You can also see the big drop that happened during the crisis and the rise that happened during the previous stamp duty holiday. And actually there was an evaluation of this tax cut which found that it was effective in increasing transactions. It also pulled transactions forward to just inside the window. But perhaps more importantly, it also increased other spending. So people move house and they spend on lots of other things to do with that. And actually, in this period at least, it was estimated that for every pound of tax cut, there was another pound of spending and economic activity that happened. So in this period at least, it was an effective stimulus. Of course, again, this crisis is different for various reasons. One is that I think we would have expected a bounce back in housing transactions anyway, because there was some pent-up demand caused by the lockdown. So I think there's a case that this measure could have been introduced later once some of that demand had come back in order to reduce some of the dead weight of the policy. Again, similarly, an issue with timing, the policy may be ending too soon. It's due to end at the end of March next year. As I showed you for the last recession, people pulled forward transactions to be within the window. I think we'd expect this again this time. If it happens, it means we could be seeing depressed housing sales at a point in time where the economy is still weak. So I think a takeaway from all of these measures is that the timing is super important for fiscal stimuluses. It's particularly hard to get right at the moment because of the uncertainty. But I think, at least personally, I think that there's a case that we moved too soon on some of these measures and that we could have waited a little bit longer. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. We still got half an hour for questions. There are quite a lot that have already come into Slido, but do feel free to add to those or to vote for what you feel are what you want to be the most popular question, which will float to the top of my screen. There's a question from someone who hasn't given their name here, asking what are the intergenerational implications of the spending pledges? How much will taxes have to go up in future to pay for all of this? Perhaps, Carl, you could have a first shot at that.
Yeah, so you've got to remember here, I think, that where we're doing spending now, where we're doing borrowing now, that secures a stronger recovery. For example, if we're spending on schemes that mean that young people who would otherwise be unemployed are able to get into the labour market and able to enjoy a better standard of living, while those young people might feel that the extra debt is not a great thing to have, they'll be pleased in the sense that the spending it went on benefited them. And overall, they might think that was money well spent, a good investment. So I don't think we should look at it as kind of all of this debt that's all going to be lumbered on younger people in the future, as long as we're spending it well and securing a good recovery. The second part of that question really is about how what do we need to do to get the debt back down again? Well, huge amounts of uncertainty at the moment. I don't think we certainly don't think the Chancellor should now be trying to set out exactly what he'll be doing over the next few years to try and achieve that. As an illustration, a scenario we put out a few weeks ago suggested that under some central economic forecast, you could be talking about tax rises of the order of about 1.5% of GDP. That's getting on for sort of 35 odd billion pounds a year in extra revenue. That might be the kind of magnitude that would stabilize the debt at its new higher level. Now, big uncertainty around that number. If we can secure a stronger recovery, if we can get more growth going forwards, that number will come down quite a bit, but it could be quite a chunky tax rise. And of course, when we're thinking about how to do that tax rise, we should certainly think about what the distribution of resources is in the economy, how it's been affected by the coronavirus, and therefore who we think should be perhaps shouldering the brunt of those rises in tax.
Great, thank you. Now let me see what else we have on Slido. There's a question here, Rob, about the Treasury's analysis of the distributional effect of the crisis, which they show as having been evenly spread across the income distribution. What do we make of that?
Yeah, so we actually did a bit of work not long ago with two different data sources, which reach the same punchline, in that if you look at total income, so this is important, including benefits and of course including the earnings that are propped up by the furlough scheme, then on average, if you rank people according to where they were before the crisis, they've been hit by a similar proportion across the income distribution. And what we were finding is that was because although it's true, as is now being quite well discussed and documented, it's true that at the very bottom of the earnings distribution, those workers are more likely to be losing work or being furloughed. If you do lose earnings and you're on a low income, you're likely to get a higher fraction of it replaced by state support, whereas if you're on a higher income, you get a much lower fraction of it replaced. So there's obviously many people losing out across the income distribution, but yet on average, we do find, like the Treasury, that it all looks fairly flat as a proportion of total income. We don't quite get the same, that there are some minor differences I noticed between ours and the Treasury's analysis. I think actually on the distributional impact purely of the job losses, they seem to get them a little bit flatter than I think we did. They do use a different data source for this, which is basically because their tax and benefit model only runs on one particular data source with a somewhat smaller sample. But yeah, the punchline is I think robust. The overall impact on incomes has been quite flat. Doesn't mean that there aren't longer term reasons to worry. Of course, if the career disruption is all being felt by people towards the bottom, then the longer term impact of that on them could well be more significant than what people are experiencing further up, again, on average.
Can I just clarify that, Rob? I think I'm right in saying that the average losses towards the top are driven by a relatively small number of people with quite big losses. In other words, they may have been furloughed or lost their job. and that's a big cut to their income. Whereas towards the bottom, there are a lot more people who have had relatively small losses. And so the average works out like that because you've got a small number of big losses at the top and a large number of small losses at the bottom. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think that is right. Yeah, I mean, one thing, so at the top, you've actually got a cap on the furlough payments for one thing. So if you do get furloughed and you're on quite high earnings, you can have potentially a very small fraction of those replaced. And as I say, at the bottom, it is more likely that people are seeing some fall in their earnings because they're more likely to be furloughed. So I think that's right. Yeah, of course, it's also the case as ever that a given fall in income as a portion of your income can be a lot harder to deal with if you are on a low income to start with.
Yeah, I think that difference is really important. So in a sense, the typical, to the extent that you can think about typical people towards the top won't have had significant losses to their income, and indeed may well be saving quite a lot over this period. But a few will have really big hits, whereas the typical person closer to the bottom is more likely to have lost as a result of the furlough, being furloughed, or indeed moving on to welfare. But their losses are quite a lot smaller. So that's where averages really do. That's where means as a measure of average is hiding a lot of the difference in the variation across the distribution. Another popular one here, Carl, is about the, I'm not sure whether we can provide a very full answer to this, is about the size of the UK's response relative to the response in other countries. Do we have a sense of the scale of what we've done relative to what others have done?
So we had a look at this back in May, which I guess is quite a long while ago now, using numbers that the IMF had put together. And it looked there pretty clear that the UK had done a smaller response than what you see in countries like Japan and the United States, and had done one that was in the same kind of ballpark, at least on the IMF data at that point in time, as countries like Germany, France had done. I think what's really hard in these comparisons, of course, is that you need to think about what the underlying tax and benefit system would have done in the absence of any response. So, for example, if the UK was doing a big response through its job retention scheme, a huge amount of spending, maybe that's because we needed to do that because our social security system was less well suited to providing people who've seen a drop in their earnings, or indeed a drop in their earnings from seeing a big increase in their social security income. Whereas if you're in a Scandinavian country, for example, or in some other countries in Western Europe, the system would more automatically provide you with that kind of insurance. So maybe you wouldn't need to do such a big response. I think the question's pretty complicated. I think even after yesterday's announcement, looking back at those IMF numbers, it's pretty clear that the Japan and US have done a bigger response than us. I think comparisons with Europe are difficult, and even if the UK was pretty big, I think you'd want to take into account differences in how their underlying tax and benefit system treat people who were employed who lose their jobs.
There's a series of questions here, all popular, which are all asking a very similar thing, which is essentially, what else should the Chancellor have done? What are the gaps? Are there significant omissions? And should he have been thinking about targeting more on sectors and locations? So that's a whole that's three questions which between them have got a lot of votes. Helen, would you like to have a first shot at that? Are there other things that Chancellor should have been doing or targeting things better?
Well, I think it's worth saying that I guess the Chancellor is trying in different areas to do the different things in terms of, preserve some of the jobs that are currently at risk, think about those people who are out of work and what you do with them, and then think about boosting demand. Sometimes he was thinking about the different types of things the government wants to do. On the tax side, I think there are other things he could think about with the fiscal stimulus, but as I was kind of pointing out in my talk, I think we should hold off on those. I think we should probably wait until we know how high demand and output is relative to current supply constraints. If it turns out, for example, at the end of the year, we're in a situation where demand is falling a long way short of current capacity, then there are other things we could think of for boosting demand, either more general VAT cuts or other things through the tax system. But I think he should hold off on that for now. I guess on the targeting, I'll leave it to Rob. But obviously, if we think there are big differences across different parts of the country, he clearly targeted the VAT cut because he felt it was a sector that was particularly badly hit. if there are other parts of the country we think are doing particularly badly, either because there are local lockdowns or because maybe rural or coastal areas were particularly badly hit because of the nature of their economies, then I guess he could have targeted more of the jobs measures, for example. But Rob might want to comment on that.
Yeah, just to pick up on that. Yeah, just briefly. I mean, there always was a case for winding down the furlough scheme in a way that was sector specific, just given the obvious differences between the outlook for different sectors. And the government was not keen on that for a few reasons, including some issues, some concerns about how practical it is always to distinguish between different sectors. And so that, I mean, for at least for the time being, that ship seems to have sailed. Obviously, it is trying to do things that are sector specific on the other side of the market, as Helen mentioned, in that it is trying to boost consumer demand in some of the most struggling sectors, which would be a way of protecting jobs. On the local element, I mean, I think one key thing here will be the role of DWP and the Job Centre Pluses, which are, they do operate around the country, and they, if they're working well, should be able to forge good links with local employers. And similarly with the additional traineeships and apprenticeships that have been announced, that's going to be an important element. The availability of work in different areas will be different. The skills that people who are looking for work have in different areas will be different, and it's a big role of job centres to play a part in trying to match those up in some sense as best as possible. So there is a local element kind of built into the system there, and it will be important that works well.
Okay, great, thank you. There's a series of questions about the fiscal situation, the long run issues with debt, and a particular one here about what we should be thinking about in terms of a new fiscal framework. So the specific question I've got in front of me is that the Chancellor's been urged to lay out new fiscal rules in the autumn to start bringing down debt to GDP by the end of the Parliament. And the question is that too early? But I guess there is a broader question about what sort of fiscal framework we should be looking for as we go forward, given that the rules certainly laid out in the Conservative manifesto are clearly out of the window now. Carl, have you had some initial thoughts on how we should be thinking about that?
Yes, so we're going to get through this crisis in a position where we'll have a deficit that's running ahead where it was expected to be a few months ago. We're going to have a debt level that's much, much higher than what was anticipated. We're also very likely to have very low interest cost of borrowing for the government, which will mean that debt interest payments will be relatively low. So in that sense, having more debt seems pretty natural. We'll also be in a world where the amount of uncertainty is much, much bigger. I think and so in terms of the magnitudes there, as I said in the talk, £350 billion worth of borrowing this year wouldn't be a surprise. Another 150 billion or so next year, so 500 over 2 years wouldn't be a surprise to answer a couple of the other questions that are coming up. I think actually at this moment, what we don't need is a new set of fiscal rules. The lesson of the last 20 years is that we keep introducing fiscal rules that are badly designed. They're not constraining enough during good periods. They're far too inflexible during adverse shocks. The risk is we'll just introduce some fiscal targets, then we'll have to abandon them very, very quickly. So you don't get any credibility with that. They're not really helping to steer what you're doing. I think at this point, what the Chancellor should be doing is setting out a broad fiscal strategy. What will his approach be to a deficit that might endure at a higher level than what he previously planned? What will be his approach to trying to manage down the debt, and to what extent does he worry about the risks that we'll be managing there in terms of if interest rates stay low, then the debt is fine. If interest rates go up, but growth is stronger, then again, that will be fine. What we've got to worry about is a world where interest rates go up and that's not accompanied by stronger growth. So I think a kind of broad fiscal strategy at this moment in those terms would be a good thing to have. I think detailed fiscal targets, I would wait at least a couple of years before setting those out. I think if we do them now, they're likely to be so unconstraining, they won't mean anything, or they're very likely just to get broken and replaced by a new set, which doesn't achieve anything.
Okay, that is going to be a big challenge going forward for sure. There's an interesting question here about why do we think that the Chancellor skated over the big increase in public service spending pretty much as a footnote to which I think the answer is probably that such a large amount of it was devoted to PPE and test and trace. And I suspect there is so much uncertainty around that and so many questions to be asked about how that is actually going to be, how that's going to be sourced and contracted, that he probably didn't want to draw attention to it. And I think that is something that perhaps the journalists among our audience might like to pursue further with government. There's another question here which has got a lot of votes, which is about the what government's done to cover losses in local budget revenues, and there was some money in there for local government. We've done, and you can see it on our website, quite an extensive analysis of the impact of the current crisis on local government spending and revenues. And actually what we find at the moment, at least, is that the impact on, despite the fact local government is responsible for social care, the impact on revenue is likely to be bigger than the impact on spending, at least in the short run, with a lot of councils losing council tax revenue because of people becoming unemployed and no longer are being required to pay full council tax. They're likely to lose out on business rates because there are going to be fewer businesses, and some will lose a lot of money from sales fees and charges. But that the distribution of these is very uneven. There are some local authorities, particularly districts, which are very dependent on sales fees and charges, and others that look in many ways quite similar, which are not dependent on those at all. Actually, we see that in many respects, it's those local authorities in more in better off areas that are losing the most, because they're most dependent on their own incomes rather than government grants. And I think the real challenge here for government is making these the payments in a way which are well targeted, given the big variation between local authorities in how much they're being hit. There's another question here, Carl, which we get asked quite a lot, which is essentially of the form, given that quite a lot of this is effectively being paid for with printed money, why don't we just print more money to pay for more?
Yeah, so since March, the outlook for the deficit's increased by about £300 billion. The government was forecasting a deficit of about £55 billion back in March. I've just said that, a lot of uncertainty, but something around 350 billion wouldn't be a surprise. So £300 billion increase. Over that period, the Bank of England have also increased its programme of quantitative easing by £300 billion. So the government will essentially be going to the markets to borrow that 300 or so extra billion pounds. Then the Bank of England will be buying those gilts off the market. So we're not expecting private sector organisations to hold more in the way of gilts than what was anticipated around March time. So should we do more? I think the answer there is pretty clear, that if there are things that we can spend the money on, given that we can borrow so cheaply, where we are confident that we can deliver a good return, be that some investment spending, be that a scheme to get people back into work or to keep their current jobs, then yes, the case is very, very strong. So it's really a question of, are the schemes where we can be confident that there isn't a lot of dead weight, that we can get big beneficial effects, and we can ensure that in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, we don't regret having the extra debt because we've got a bigger economy as a result of the spending we did that was financed by that debt.
There's a couple of questions here about the impact on older workers. We have focused quite a lot on, and the Chancellor has focused quite a lot on young workers, but we know that it can be much more, it can be a really big issue for older workers losing their jobs. And we know from the 1980s crisis that some never got back into work again. Rob, should the Chancellor be doing more to support older workers? I mean, those over 25 to some extent, but indeed those over 50 or 55, but perhaps particularly?
Yeah, I think the premise of the question is right. And those at the other end of the working age spectrum can also be among the most vulnerable, and can find it hardest to find work again. I would also add, thinking about the wider context, that there's a group of people on sort of the cusp of retirement, or who might be considering retirement if they've lost work now, might be considering retirement earlier than they would have done, who might also be a little vulnerable to volatility in the stock market and to what that does to their pension provision if they have DC pensions. So I think there is a group there that could be relatively vulnerable. There's nothing specific for them here. The Chancellor would probably say that the raft of active labour market policies, the extra resources for DWP's various programs would be the kind of thing that he hopes is going to make a difference to them as well as other groups that aren't, as well as other groups. But I agree with the premise of the question. I think that is a potentially also one of the more vulnerable than average groups.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we quite rightly focus on the fact that the young have done very badly over the last few years and are doing very badly at the moment. But for groups of those towards the end of their working life, the long run impacts can be very substantial. And as some work we showed last year shows that those few years before you hit actual state pension age can be absolutely terrible in terms of incomes, because state support at those ages is way below state support once you hit pension age, and the difficulties in getting jobs can be very substantial for that group. We're running towards the end of this session. There's one, again, a similar sort of question, one that's moved to the top, which is really asking about the scale of potential tax hikes or spending cuts over the coming decades. As a final step, Carl, would you like to speculate on that?
Okay, so as I said before, huge amounts of uncertainty. It's very hard to put a number on it. We had a stab at that a couple of weeks ago, though. If you wanted to, under a central scenario, if you wanted to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio at its new higher level, you could be talking about tax rises or spending cuts, if you prefer, of about 1.5% of GDP. So that's sort of 35 to 40 billion pounds. Clearly, announcing that is not going to be pain-free. It'll be very different. It'll have a very different feel to it to the kind of announcements we heard yesterday, which were about the Chancellor providing more support to different groups. So when we do get through this crisis, and these aren't measures that need to be implemented and should not be implemented anytime soon, there'll have to be a lot of careful thought about how to design those measures, how to do them in a way which causes the least amount of economic harm, because you can do tax rises in a very damaging way or a less damaging way, and also who should bear the costs of that, which will depend a lot on how some of the inequalities through this crisis are playing out. But it could be a pretty big tax rise, and it will also come, of course, on top of other pressures that the public finances are under, as, for example, an aging population puts more pressure on our social care and our NHS. And another reason why we might decide after this crisis to push up taxes a bit will be if the public and if politicians decide that because of the crisis, we want to have more generous spending in some areas. So again, I wouldn't be surprised if as a result of this, we choose to spend more on the NHS, we choose more to spend on social care. So that's even without a weakened economy, there may well be demands for greater tax revenue.
Okay, one very, very fast last question, Helen. Stamp duty, might it just push up prices? On the one hand, might it stimulate more house building? On the other, are there other things we could do in the housing market?
So yes, I suspect it will push up prices. I mean, in the short run, I think it will be hard for prices to adjust really quickly, but as the year goes on, I'd expect more of the prices to go up. In some ways, that doesn't really matter. I mean, it affects who gets the benefit, but a lot of the fiscal stimulus from this is coming not from people swapping houses, it's coming from the spending that happens around it. So you move house, you renovate, you buy white goods and all that kind of stuff. So it's that's really providing the fiscal stimulus. So I think that's what we expect. In some ways, if you want to get the housing market going, I think this probably was the best measure to pick, because We know that even in normal times, stamp duty is a bad tax. It slows down transactions, so getting rid of it is a good thing. In fact, longer term, we could think about scrapping stamp duty and fixing council tax at the same time. I guess if the government was thinking about house building, it could also look at the planning regime, for example, and making it easier to plan. But I think actually for the housing market, cutting stamp duty was a pretty good time. Okay, there's a timing question. I would have cut it later personally, but it probably wasn't a bad one to pick.
Great. Well, we're bang on 10:30. So thank you very much, Carl, Helen and Rob. Thank you very much, all of you who have been watching this. All of the slides and my remarks will be up on the IFS website, alongside a huge amount of analysis we've done over the last several months on the coronavirus and the economic impacts and response to it. So thank you again, everyone, for watching, and please stay in touch and keep an eye on our analysis as we go forward. Thank you.